Brother Turner wasn't scheduled to be my moderator. My moderator was supposed to come up from Granbury, but he was not able to do so. And at the last minute, we got a pinch hitter, Charles Turner from Greenville, Texas. And it's nice to be here with this congregation and with Mr. Hatcher as an opponent in the debate, and with my good friend David Brown, whom I have debated and met previously in Austin, Texas, where he was head of the Bible School, the Institute for Bible Studies there at Southwest Church of Christ. The proposition this evening has been read and the rules have been gone over, and I'm in the mood for applying for some loans, because I don't know if I can get through this debate without mentioning those dreaded words that David read. But I'm going to do the best I can, and if I make a slip, if anybody's got any money they want to loan at about 5% interest, well, you can see me after debate. Now, Brother Schweitzer, will you put up my chart number P1, the proposition defined? I'm going to try to use charts in this debate so everyone can see. While he's finding that one, it's right near the top. Mr. Hatcher gave me some questions. We agreed for questions to be exchanged before the debate, and I gave him some back so he would have something to talk about from his point of view, because I know those questions were written out so he could kind of catch me one way or the other. But at any rate, he gave me some questions, and I'll probably be getting to those. But first of all, I want to get to my proposition. The proposition defined. Do we have a pointer? Is this a pointer here? Oh, thank you. I didn't bring my fool's cue. The proposition defined, New Testament Scriptures, the 27 writings, Matthew to Revelation, authorized. The New Testament teaches that all Scripture is to be used by today's people to find instruction on matters of faith and practice in the worship of God. 2 Timothy 3:16, I hope that you're familiar with that. I don't have time to read all these passages. Romans 15:4, 1 Timothy 5:18, Acts 17:11, 2 Timothy 2:15. Copy those down and read them when you get home, and you'll see that all Scripture is to be used by today's people to find instruction on matters of faith and practice, Old Testament and New Testament. Authorized means that a doctrine and practice has the positive approbation of God and is to be believed and practiced consistent with the revelation of His Word in all Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament. The use of mechanical instruments of music in worship of God today, we find in all Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, that there are two kinds of instruments: wind instruments, Genesis 4:21, and vibration instruments, Genesis 4:21. These instruments have always had the approbation of God when used in worship, and this approbation was never rescinded at any time in the New Testament subsequent to the Old Testament period. Worship today. Worship is the praise and adoration of God, and we're told to use psalms in our worship today. This carries with it the use of instruments, as psalms are not modified anywhere, and I want to emphasize this. I'll be giving this to Mr. Hatcher all during this debate. Psalms are not modified anywhere in the New Testament on the matter of instruments. Now, you'll find psalms modified on certain things like animal sacrifices and some of the Old Testament practices, but nowhere are psalms modified on the use of instruments. They are New Testament modifications of some things in psalms, but none on instrumental music. And Paul tells us in Ephesians 5:16 and the book of Colossians that we are to use psalms in worship.
Can I rise at one more just a moment?
Yes, sir.
Get it cleared up. I think we're supposed to have, we'll stop these times in the line. We're supposed to have a copy of the chart.
That's right. Each one of those will have a copy of the chart so you can hand it to him. I'm sorry about that. Excuse me. All right, now let us put up number 2, P2. I am affirming only what is commanded. Now, these men have been getting by with murder in the last few years because some of these fellows going around here believing in instrumental music, like Blakely did in his debate, they just give up on the idea that the Bible commands or authorizes music. Well, I take the position the Bible authorizes, ladies and gentlemen, that we use instrumental music. I am affirming only what is commanded in Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16. You're familiar with those. Look them up, read them for yourself. I am not affirming the use of things clearly specified in the New Testament having no further place in worship. Now he'll come up here and he'll talk about dancing and incense and animal sacrifices and Nadab and Abihu and Noah and the ark and all kinds of malarkey that has nothing to do with Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16, which commands Psalms to be used. Now stick to the subject, Mr. Hatcher, and don't go floating in Noah's ark, or don't go out here with Nadab and Abihu with your strange fire and jelly on the Lord's Supper bread and that kind of stuff. Stick with Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. We're not affirming any further place for animal sacrifices. They are not commanded in the New Testament, but Psalms are commanded in Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3. We're not affirming Old Testament ordinances today. Hebrews 9 and 10 reveals, that's chapters 9 and 10, reveals that certain things were for the time back in the Old Testament and until the time of Reformation. And he specifies those things. If you read the book of Hebrews, you'll find out what they are, but you'll never find instruments of music mentioned in Hebrews or any other epistle as being for the time. We're not affirming non-scriptural red herrings like snake handling, as Adam Hires did in his debate, rosary beads, jelly on the Lord's Supper bread, the baptism of animals like J.D. Bales talked about, and other irrelevant items offered by the opposers of music were never approved of God in worship to begin with. Never approved of God in worship to begin with. Psalms are commanded. The use of musical instruments with psalms has never been repealed or modified. And that's what we will affirm in this debate. Now give me P3. I will show from the Church of Christ system, and you held my time a while ago, gave me a little 30 seconds or so on that, whatever it was. I will show from the Church of Christ system on Bible authority that there is direct command, approved action, implication, inference for instrumental music. Now, I don't give a hoot, so to speak, for this so-called man-made jargon here, but I'm going to take his own system of interpreting the Bible, and I'm going to turn it on him and show him that by every one of these things that he calls a way to interpret for authority out of the Bible, to find Bible authority. I'm going to show him that every one of those authorizes the use of instrumental music. Now give me an M1, brother, and this is a reward I'm offering for everyone in the congregation. Anybody inside, outside the congregation in Burke, Burnett, Wichita Falls, state of Texas, United States of America, or the world, or out on beyond on the moon, or anywhere else, $100 reward for every person for a Bible verse where singing is called music. Now, he'll get up here and say, Mr. Ross doesn't believe singing is music. Mr. Ross didn't say that. Mr. Ross wants the verse where that singing is called music. Now, why do I insist on it that way? Give me the next chart, M2. Mr. Hatcher is a member of a church that historically and presently has a motto which say, we call Bible things by Bible names. Now, if so, Mr. Hatcher, where does the Bible call singing vocal music? Now, I don't need Webster's Dictionary. I don't need the New American Heritage Dictionary or New World Dictionary. I want where the Bible calls singing or vocal music. I want the terminology where singing in the Bible is called music. Now, until that time, why don't you drop this jargon about vocal music, as you say, and call singing vocal music. You'll never find it in the Bible, ladies and gentlemen. One must not assume, Wayne Jackson says, a friend of his, what a verse does not say. Now, he can quote singing, but he'll never find where it says singing is music or vocal music, and anyone in this congregation that can find that Bible terminology, calling Bible things with Bible names, you got $100 for you if you can find where singing is ever called in the Bible music. In the Bible, the word music is used exclusively, ladies and gentlemen, of instruments. Instrumental music. Used one time in the New Testament. In the book of Luke, it refers to a symphony. It's used in the Old Testament several times, always referring to instruments of music. Now let's go on again to M3, the word music in the New Testament. Used of instruments or used of singing, and I want Mr. Hatcher to come up here, and I'll keep throwing this at him through the debate. I want him to give us the verse that tells us where music in the New Testament is used of instruments or is it used of singing. Now he claims New Testament authority. I can give him New Testament authority where that music and instruments are used, but he can't give me any New Testament authority where singing is referred to as music in the New Testament. Now let's go on to another one. Number 4, M4. Now he's got this terminology that I've heard them use for years, and I've often said, where is it in the Bible? And none of them come up with any Bible terminology. They say we got two kinds of music. We got instrumental music and we got vocal music. Now I want to know where vocal music is. Is this man-made terminology or is it Bible terminology? We'll let Mr. Hatcher give us the answer. Now let's have another one. I asked him a question about the tuning fork a while ago. We could have thrown in there also the pitchfork, or the pitch pipe, I should say. It's TF1. Now, the tuning fork, Mr. Hatcher, is it scriptural? If so, give us the verse. Is it unscriptural? If so, give us the verse on that. And you can throw in the pitch pipe also if you have a tendency to want to use either of these. We want a scripture to justify using this in the worship of God if you think that's important. Give me TF2. Now, how many notes does the Bible authorize us to play with a tuning fork or a pitch pipe? 1 note, 2 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes, or how many? I want a verse that tells us, I want scriptural proof where you've got any authority to use either one of them for 1 note or more. Now give me TF3. Mr. A.G. Hobbs, one of their ministers who writes a lot of tracts I see in their churches all over the country. Everywhere I've ever debated Churches of Christ, you'll see some of these little blue booklets by A.G. Hobbs. He says, some leaders should learn to sing without having to lean on a tuning fork for pitch. I want to know, does Mr. Hatcher agree with that, or does he disagree with that? Sounds like Mr. Hobbs may be indicating there that it's just not quite right to use that pitch pipe, or tuning fork. Now let's go to PS1. The Psalms here. The Bible authorizes the use of Old Testament Psalms in New Testament worship. I want to know if Mr. Hatcher agrees with this. The Bible authorizes the use of Old Testament Psalms in New Testament worship. I affirm that it does. In Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16, I affirm it does. Now, I want Hatcher's answer. Does he believe that? Does he use Psalms? Here's his hymn book. I don't see a Psalm in there. I see a lot of sectarian writers in there. One of the brothers made me a list of some of them a while ago. Several sectarian songs: Martin Luther, Charles Moody, Franz Gruber, Roman Catholic, Charles Wesley, a Methodist. He's singing sectarian songs, and he says if you don't sing them, you're going to hell. If you don't worship God singing without music, you're going to hell. And here's the songbook he used, written by sectarian writers, Roman Catholics, Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, and others. And so you got to sing these sectarian denominational hymns or you're going to hell, and you can't use any music when you're singing them. Now you say, is that his doctrine? Certainly it's his doctrine. If you don't come here in this congregation, in this city, and you sing without music, sing without instruments, and sing these sectarian hymns that were written after the Bible was written, by the way. He doesn't sing the Psalms of the Bible. He quotes this verse, Ephesians 5:19, and he's never sung one of those songs yet. He never has sung one of those songs. He's using this hymn book right here, written just a few years ago, published by one of the denominational Church of Christ publishing houses, if you'll let me use that word, Howard Publishing, and they use Baptist preachers, Methodist preachers, Lutheran preachers, Presbyterian preachers, Roman Catholics, and what do? They sing this to go to heaven. They say that's commanded. I just can't see the logic of that. Now look at Psalms PS2, brother. If the Psalms were nailed to the cross, like some of these men are prone to say, why are we told to use Psalms? Are these the Psalms that were nailed to the cross? I read in one of their magazines that we're no longer under the Psalms. The Psalms were nailed to the cross. And then over here at Brother Brown's church in Southwest Church of Christ in Austin, Texas, with Brother Bill Jackson, they had a conference over there, a lectureship they call it, and they put out 2 books on the Psalms. And here they say the Psalms were nailed to the cross, and now they're over there using those in a whole lectureship. Well, if they're nailed to the cross, what in the world are they fooling around with them for? I tell you what, Paul didn't know anything about it because he says you're to use Psalms in your singing. All these verses right here, you can jot them down. Now, if they were nailed to the cross, why are we told to use the Psalms? Now let's look at PS3, what the Spiritual Sword, the #1 magazine of the Brotherhood, has to say about this. Spiritual Sword, PS3, says the Psalms command instruments. Flavel Nichols, one of their writers, in Spiritual Sword, July 1990, page 20. The Psalms command the use of the instrument, he said. Also, if Psalms were no part of the law that was abolished, then there would be divine authority for instrumental music and praising God today. Then, Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16 are evidence that Psalms were no part of the law that was abolished, for these verses authorize the use of Psalms. Now, how could they authorize the use of something that had been abolished? And Mr. Hatcher even said they had vanished. In one of his articles in the Burt Burnett Star, Informer Star, he said it had vanished. The Psalms are part of the law that had vanished. And yet Paul didn't know anything about it, because he tells us in these verses to use Psalms. And this man says that the Psalms command the use of the instrument, and nowhere in the New Testament did the writers ever say that the Psalms have been modified or abridged or annulled on that. And you better not start annulling God's law and kicking it out just because you've been trained in a traditional church back about 100 and something years that there's no music to be used. Now let's go on here. Hence we have Bible authority, Old and New Testament, to use instruments. Now the spiritual sword, once again, PS4. The spiritual sword on music in the Old Testament. Have I got any time left?
4 minutes.
Okay, good. Getting a lot of material in. Now here's the spiritual sword on music in the Old Testament. Use of instrumental music began before the giving of the law. Before the giving of the law. He's going to come up here and say, hey, this was part of the law. No, it says here it began before the giving of the law. Then they say, Spiritual Sword, 1078, instrumental music was used in the Mosaic system of the Old Testament, certainly. Then they go on, instrumental music was at the command of the Lord. Now we want to know if Mr. Hatcher is going to take that position, or is he going to take this half-wit position of men like Goldwell Music and Guy Woods and some of those fellows who say that God never did command instrumental music. I'll give you a chart on that when I get to it for long. Show you how they're split up. They got two sides. One of them saying God never did command instrumental music. The other one saying, oh yes, he did command instrumental music in the Old Testament. Now look at this. All these texts here in 2 Chronicles, 1 Chronicles that they give, and Nehemiah and Ezra, instrumental music was at the command of the Lord. Then, next one, the text of the Psalms themselves encourage men to make use of instruments in praising God. Then on down, worship with instruments of music in the Old Testament was incorporated into the law by God Himself. It says here in the Spiritual Sword magazine, the religion of classical Greece and the Jewish temple liturgy both used musical instruments extensively, the Spiritual Sword says. Instrumental music admittedly was used in worship under the Old Testament, and instrumental music was religiously right in worship under the Old Covenant simply because it was commanded. Then instrumental music and praising God is authorized in Psalms, and the Psalms command the use of the instrument. Now I thought you'd like to know what the Spiritual Sword said about this, because some of these Church of Christ preachers, they'll tell you that God never did command instruments in the Old Testament, that David did wrong when he introduced instruments in the Old Testament, that Amos condemned David and pronounced a woe on him, according to Guy Woods, in the Old Testament. And all these fellows, like David Brown's friend Robert Taylor, he damns those in the Old Testament for using musical instruments. So I want you to see what the Spiritual Sword had to say. Now let's go on to J1. Jesus fulfilled the law, and He established the law. According to Matthew 5:17 and Romans 3:31, He fulfilled the law, and He established the law. And the law nailed to the cross is the typical aspects of law. The patterns, the figures, and the shadows mentioned in the book of Hebrews and other epistles, and the curse mentioned in the book of Galatians regarding the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, musical instruments never were against us. They were always for us. Everywhere in the Bible you read about musical instruments, they're for us. They never were against us. None of the moral, spiritual, and non-typical elements of law were annulled under number 2 up here. None of them were annulled, repealed, or modified, but they're reaffirmed. They are eternal principles, and you can read about it in these texts, Romans 7:12 and so forth, that I have on the chart. Now, repetitions of law principles are made in the New Testament, which simply reinforce the law under the lordship of Christ, who is the Lord of the law. Remember where Jesus said He was the Lord of the Sabbath? He could have simply also said He's Lord of the law, the whole law, because He is God in the flesh. He's the eternal Son of God. He's the one that even gave the law, because He is in the Trinity of the Godhead. So Jesus Christ is the Lord over the law. Now, fulfillment of temporary or for the time, as Hebrews says, elements of the law are clearly delineated in regard to their fulfillment. For example, we have circumcision and days and meats and ceremonies and sacrifices mentioned in the book of Hebrews, but you'll never find instruments of music mentioned there as being types. A type that was fulfilled, a shadow that was fulfilled, a pattern that was fulfilled, or anything of the nature of instrumental music. You have to shove it in, read it in, throw it in. You cannot read it out of the Scripture itself. It's not there. Then the teaching on the use of Psalms, Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, reveals that this was not for the time practice. It was not one of those kind of practice like offering animal sacrifices or doing something else that was for the time that the epistles said were fulfilled. Now, time, is that it? Okay, thank you.